Okay, welcome everyone to what I hope will be the only online class that we have. I'm recording this on the 5th of January, so we haven't had our first class yet. So I'm not really sure exactly what the rest of the term is going to look like. I'm very hopeful that we actually get a chance to meet in person, and this will be the only kind of online um, lecture that or meeting that we have to have. But uh, uh, and I'm recording this before our first class too, so I apologize if I repeat some things I say in the first class. But there were a few things that while I'm out of town that I thought I would kind of go over with you, and as you're reading the first chapter in Gross, and also the chapter 14, we're looking at the various kind of perspectives and systems in psychology. There's a lot of terminology right in there. And in a course like this, getting comfortable with some of the terms is really, really important. That's why I have in the discussion questions, here's some must-know kinds of terms that you should get to know for the course, because it'll be absolutely essential to feel a little bit comfortable with those concepts and be able to work with those things. So I wanted to, go over just a couple of things to begin with, and kind of get us into I guess, the mood, if you will, of critical issues. It is a different kind of course than you're used to in psychology, probably. And it's sort of an honor, to be able to teach it. I really enjoy this course. It's one of those courses that I probably will say this in the first class, but when it goes well, it goes really well, and when it doesn't go well, so we can kind of hope for the best as far as the kind of format we're going to have. So what I wanted to get into today, and I'm just going to now share some files, share this kind of overhead with you. Um, it's just some, as I said, some basic terms and perspectives and ideas that we're going to need to make our way through the course. So here we have invitation to discourse, dialogue, and deconstruction. So yes, that really does say it, because one of the things that you'll see right away is that there is a great deal of focus on language in the things we talk about in this class. And language, not in the kind of Piagetian or Vygotskian sense of, the cognitive tools that we develop to express ourselves, but language in the social, or what we'll call intersubjective sense later on, shared meanings, cultural, social, historical discourse that evolves over time. And it really turns out to be extremely important for thinking about psychology, because as you read about in the first chapter, psychology really is, I mean, by definition, it is us studying ourselves, right? I mean, that's what it is. And so what we've done is we've created a language with which to do that. Depression, anxiety, personality, and so forth. And so there really is, language plays a central role. I think it is probably the most fundamental aspect of psychology. It's not usually presented that way. Usually it's something like behavior or something like that. But of course, identifying something as a behavior requires language, and even thinking about something in terms of being a behavior in the first place is a linguistic and conceptual sort of act. But yeah, so I think there is a great deal of focus on language. And then deconstruction, of course, we'll talk about postmodernism a bit later in the course, but I'm using deconstruction here in two senses. In the more, I guess, formal sense of what started as a movement in literary theory in the 20th century, kind of mid 20th century, with people like Julia Kristeva and Jacques Lacan. And that is that looking at the way language works to create meaning, and then kind of deconstructing that, or pulling that apart, understanding the origins of how we speak and how we think, and those kinds of things. And that certainly is a part of what we do in here. But in a general kind of sense, we don't actually read the deconstructionists, but that would be too far off base. But the influence of that move is considerable in postmodern thought. And then deconstruction also, and just kind of the general sense of just kind of trying to get a firmer understanding about why we do things the way we do, understanding the origins historically, socially, conceptually, for why psychology goes about doing the things that it does, and trying to put that into some more critical perspective, I guess you could say. Right. But first I wanted to go through, hopefully I didn't say this in the first class and forget that I had talked about this in the video, but first I wanted to go through a couple of disclaimers about, if you haven't had a course with me before, this might be particularly relevant, because I may have mentioned this in other classes that I have, but some things that I find that students don't often understand about psychology and about, their own field. You're majoring in the field, and some things I think you should really understand about the field of psychology. And the first is that we often think of, in North America, just generally speaking, especially in psychology, but we often think of science and philosophy as sort of opposites, right? That the scientist is the person who puts on the lab coat and goes and makes observations and measurements and so forth, and comes out with this kind of, kind of factual kind of knowledge. And the philosopher is someone who kind of sits in the armchair and theorizes, and it's all very much kind of intellectual and in the head, so to speak. And it just, as Samuel Johnson says, philosophy or philosophers like to kick up a lot of dust and then complain because they can't see, right? That sort of idea. I think that's how people in psychology often view philosophy and philosophizing, is kicking up a lot of dust and then complaining because you can't see, right? And it doesn't really go anywhere, and it's not very useful, and so forth. And I think that, that really is unfortunate, simply because, first and foremost, historically, you can look and see very clearly that the foundation of science is philosophy, right? I mean, literally, it is philosophy. It is the combination of two philosophical streams of thought, rationalism and empiricism. You see them kind of coming together really with Kant in the late 18th century. But the way we think about modern science today is a combination of rationalist philosophy, which was the idea that knowledge is based on some kind of theoretical, logical, conceptual interconnections of statements, right? And that knowledge is based on reason, essentially, and the use of reason in constructing theoretical models, for instance, or using statistics, right, in order to make predictions. It's an expression of a rationalist kind of philosophy. And then empiricism, obviously you probably know the word empiricism in the more general sense, but empiricism was the philosophy that all knowledge is based on observation, and based, even perhaps more fundamentally, based on experience, because observation is based on experience. But that idea of knowledge being based on experience and then knowledge being based on reason were once kind of opposed to each other, but then by the late 18th century sort of get melded together into a kind of framework that we would think of as experimental science and scientific practice today. So as I said, right, philosophy is not opposite of science. Science is philosophy. It is an expression of philosophy. And once you really start understanding any kind of scientific field, psychology tries to hide this. I'm exposing it, of course, in this course, but you can see this very clearly in a field like physics, for instance. Once you get past, some pretty basic sort of scientific sort of procedures and so forth, and you really get into the field, there's a lot of theory. You have to understand a lot of the conceptual frameworks, the predictions, the models, the equations. There's a great deal of theory in science, and so theory is absolutely fundamental, integral to science. In psychology, we don't really think of it that way. Because theory sounds like philosophy. Theory sounds like it's philosophical, and so we kind of try to make everything seem very, very concrete and very factual. And of course, more than anything, very practical, because you can only have practical knowledge if it's more theoretical, or more only practical knowledge if it's more concrete. So so this is the sort of tension here, I think, is that psychology wanting to be applied and practical and useful, they kind of push away this idea that there's theory, and that theoretical disagreements and theoretical perspectives are sort of kind of like philosophy. And I think we really just need to expose that as the misperception once and for all, and that really it's unscientific to think of a science as just simply based on, you go out and make a bunch of observations and there's no theory involved. It is a certain kind of relationship between theory and observation that makes science. So that leads me to my next point, which is, certainly from my perspective, I think I'm often referred to as being philosophical, and in the sense that I was just speaking about, in this kind of misshapen sort of, where is this going? There's no answers here. How am I ever going to use this sort of idea? And from my perspective on that, right, is that I am absolutely pro-science. I am absolutely pro-science. What I am against is scientism, right? And scientism is this idea that we're going to look to science for answers, for certainty. It's going to prove things, right? It's going to give us some kind of truth, right? And this sort of idea. Absolutely against that, because science is not about certainty. Religion gives you certainty. If you want certainty, go to religion, right? The science is not about that. Science is about making predictions. Science is about providing knowledge and information based on observation, all those kinds of good things. Science, as I said, involves theory. Theories are very, very seldom proven, right? That isn't what scientists do. They don't go out to prove things. We kind of use that word, I think, in error, because, I mean, how often can you think of a theory being proven? The theory of natural selection, evolution through natural selection, is not proven. There's no way to prove it, right? Because to prove something, you have to eliminate all of the other possible alternatives. And to eliminate all of the other possible explanations for something like evolution, or anything really, is very, very, if not impossible to do in most cases. So, I mean, and I won't go on about that, but yes, I think we should really take the term and the idea of proving something, or proven. Proof may be okay if you use it in a special sense, but proving something or proving a theory, we should just take that idea and throw it out. Don't ever say that. Don't ever think it. Don't ever use it, because you're never going to need it in psychology, right? You're not going to need it in other sciences either, really, because it just shows you don't know what you're talking about by talking in those terms. But just eliminate that, right? So that's all part of scientism, right? That's kind of trying to give us something that it really can't. My background is, my first major, I shouldn't say background, my first major was physics, and I love science. What I don't love is the way that psychology tries to latch itself on to this idea of, really, it's kind of more of a scientism to kind of make itself appear something more than it isn't. Like, for instance, trying to eliminate the role of theory, and that we don't use theory in psychology. We're just all based on observations and proof and so forth. So this kind of this kind of perception is what you'll find in this course that I'm very much critiquing and offering up a series of critiques of. And although we're not investigating science per se, I think science is a form of critical inquiry in the broadest sense. There is a scientific, certainly, spirit here. Now, if you look at the syllabus, Wittgenstein's quote, psychology has experimental methods and conceptual confusion. That, as I said probably in the first class, that quote pretty much sums up my view of the field, in many respects. And unfortunately, most psychologists, and this was made back in the 1920s when he said this, most psychologists today have a very poor understanding of their own philosophy of science. And they have a very dim recognition that they need to have an understanding of their philosophy of science, because they're not taught it. when they're taught method, they're taught techniques of statistical calculation. And that is not method. Method is a grounding in a philosophy of science, a logic of justification for why you're using this particular method or this particular set of techniques, and having some kind of conceptual grasp about, how that within a range of alternatives is best suited to the subject matter that you're studying. But those kinds of questions don't get asked as you've taken the methods classes, right? And depending on how it was taught to you, I really wonder, how those things are presented and how well we really examine, the philosophy of science of our field. But for the most part, this is not examined. So this is what we're kind of making up for in this course. So how do we really, in the broadest sense, how do we imagine going about this, right? Taking a critical look at psychology or entering into a kind of critical discourse. And there are really three, I guess, entry points or ways to kind of enter the conversation. I'll start with the one that probably is gained the most attention, and that is what we talk about in terms of things like social justice perspectives, right? Or critical race theory, right? Things that address the moral, ethical dimensions of discourse. And so you may, or maybe you haven't, but it's certainly, there's certainly been news items about, recently, for instance, the most clear example, APA recently issued an apology, which was, I think, a pretty historic move. And there's, and I have listed on our Moodle site, I believe, a link to this, but have made an apology and listed a kind of a chronology and historical overview of the kinds of racial kind of prejudices and justices, a kind of history of racial prejudice that has gone on within and was institutionalized. It was kind of a part of systemic racism within the field, within the culture, through much of the late 19th and early 20th century in psychological research. And this kind of the social justice perspective is trying to get at how things like language and different forms of social practice perpetuate stereotypes, right, about race, about different kinds of cultures and so forth. Part of this, one of the biggest examples, of course, is in IQ testing, right? And this is there's a long history to that about racial differences of IQ. It's still being discussed, even to this day, even after all of the critiques of that going all the way back to the eugenicists. So, so one way, what I'm coming to is that one way of thinking about what we're doing in this course is to take something like the social justice perspective and see how it is, in a sense, critiquing systemically things like psychological research, psychological knowledge, the terminology, the concepts that were used in the past, and how that might influence what we're doing today, right? Why do we need social justice? Why do we need these kinds of kinds of things? Well, because language isn't neutral, right? Language carries, it's sort of invisible to us at the moment, but when you look back over history, you can see that language carries within it all kinds of different meanings and beliefs and so forth that we would consider hugely bigoted or sexist or racist, right, today. So that's one way. That's, if we want to come into it from that perspective, it isn't really so much my perspective, although we do talk about this in the course as well. But that's one way of kind of coming in and stepping in and going, okay, why do we need, what are we talking about here with social justice, with critical race theory? How does this apply to psychology? Why is it important to think about it in terms of psychological research, psychological knowledge? Those kinds of questions get you into this kind of critical discourse that we're getting into in this class. The other way would be a third way would be the practical and methodological approach. If you took, when you took your 278, 279, right, I'm sure in some sense reviewed qualitative and quantitative methodologies. Perhaps they were compared and contrasted. The different kinds of, different kinds of qualitative methods, the different kinds of quantitative methods. You can ask the question, what's the best method here, right? What's the best method to investigate a human being, to investigate his or her experience, the reasons why they do what they do, right? Causal, explanations, descriptions, right? Those kinds of things. So that's another way of getting into that kind of question and kind of digging into what's the foundation here for psychological knowledge. What does it look like, right? And then that, of course, could take you into moral, ethical, social justice kinds of questions. For instance, so the link there between those two blocks, one example of that might be, well, if you look at how did qualitative research finally, after being present in many other fields, finally make its way into psychology? Well, it was through what we would think of as kind of marginalized voices, the LGBTQ communities, for instance. Their perspectives, their experiences were not being reflected in the mainstream kind of quantitative, multiple choice, paper and pencil kinds of tests, the Likert scale kind of measures, right? Those kinds of things. These were the communities, these were the voices that weren't being heard. And so qualitative research was a way of giving voice to that, of investigating that, because it's dealing more with narratives, right? Or at least one perspective would be it's dealing more with first-person experience, right? So it isn't turning it into a number. It's keeping contact with those original people and their experiences and retaining the uniqueness of that. So there you can see this connection, right, between those two blocks, and you can certainly see that. Well, you might say, well, then it's important to look at qualitative methods because it often allows us to discover meanings that may not be heard in other approaches or from different groups. And then the top one, the philosophical and epistemological, is, I guess, probably the way I approach the course and the material in the course, just because that's my training, my background, stronger and more in terms of the philosophical and epistemological kinds of questions. And so, for instance, I ask the questions like, well, like I was talking before about language, right? We're talking about ourselves. We're studying ourselves in psychology. We're creating our own language to do that. We come up with our own terminology, and then we try to measure that and investigate those kinds of concepts. Well, how does that work? How is context, social context, cultural context, influencing the way we think about ourselves, the way we investigate ourselves, right? So you can have this kind of approach where you're kind of examining it more from a philosophical perspective, or epistemologically kind of evaluating, understanding the material, so we'll talk about later, more of a social constructionist perhaps approach, which would be coming out of this idea about the social construction of meaning and historical construction of meaning over time. So those are three different ways that you could kind of approach what we're going to be talking about. We'll be talking about all three of them, but I sort of get us into the game, so to speak, by approaching things more from the philosophical epistemological sense. But all of these things become interrelated with each other as we go through the course.